Sean Winchester had always loved the wide, open spaces of his home state of Texas. The sprawling highways and big skies had been both a comfort and a workplace as he delivered packages to towns and ranches. Growing up in such a vast landscape, Sean had developed a healthy respect for the wilderness and its dangers. It was that respect and an inkling of unease that followed him into Montana's frozen expanses during a winter road trip with friends. They had planned the trip as an escape from routine, a chance to experience the raw beauty of Montana's mountains and valleys in the stark quiet of winter. The promise of snow-covered forests and isolation had sounded like a dream to Sean, who spent most of his days weaving through urban sprawl. Yet, as the group drove deeper into the remote regions, the dream began to feel more like a warning. The wind had been howling since they crossed into a dense forest, a reminder that Montana's winters weren't kind. Storm clouds churned in the sky, heavy with snow that seemed ready to fall at any moment. The group parked their car at the edge of a trail leading into the woods, deciding to explore before nightfall. Sean carried a pack with essentials: a flashlight, water, a hatchet, and a knife. His years of delivery driving had taught him to be practical, though he wondered if any of it would truly help in the wilderness. As they trudged through the snow, the forest seemed unnervingly quiet. The wind whispered through the trees, but even the sounds of wildlife were sparse. It wasn't long before Sean noticed tracks in the snow. At first, they looked like deer prints, but something about their shape was off, elongated as if the creature had a strange gait. Probably just an animal, Sean muttered, though his stomach twisted. His friends nodded, their laughter forced as they tried to shake off the creeping unease. They hadn't gone much farther when the feeling of being watched settled over them. Sean stopped and scanned the woods, his breath visible in the icy air. Between the trees, he caught a glimpse of movement, too quick to identify, but large. The others saw it too, their chatter fading into silence. "What the hell was that?" one of them whispered. Sean's heart pounded. The figure had been upright, but its proportions were wrong, its arms too long, its posture slightly hunched. He thought of a video he'd seen on YouTube, a documentary about skinwalkers, creatures from Navajo legend that could mimic human voices and take on animal forms. Though the lore was tied to the Southwest, the resemblance sent a shiver down his spine. As they turned back toward the car, the figure began to follow, staying just out of sight. It moved with an uncanny silence, darting from tree to tree. By the time they reached the clearing where they'd parked, the storm had arrived. Snow began to fall in heavy flakes, obscuring the path and muffling sound. They decided to stay near the car, lighting a fire to keep warm while they waited for the storm to pass. Sean sat close to the flames, his eyes scanning the woods. His thoughts wandered to his family in Texas. His mother, who had always warned him about venturing too far into the unknown, and his younger brother, who would have thought this whole trip was the coolest thing ever. A loud crack interrupted his thoughts. The group turned toward the sound, their flashlights piercing the darkness. A tree limb had fallen, but the cause wasn't clear. Then they saw it, just at the edge of the firelight. The creature stood partially obscured by a tree, its shape more distinct now. It was tall, with a gaunt, almost skeletal frame. Its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the light of the fire. Sean's breath caught in his throat as it moved closer, its gait unnatural, its limbs contorting as if it were still learning how to walk. Panic set in. "Get to the car," Sean yelled, but the snow had piled high and the vehicle was partially buried. They grabbed what they could and ran into the woods, hoping to lose the creature in the storm. The wind howled around them and visibility was nearly zero. Sean led the way by his flashlight, cutting a narrow path through the snow. The creature's growls echoed behind them, low and guttural, seeming to come from all directions at once. When one of his friends slipped and fell, Sean turned back to help. But before he could reach them, the creature lunged from the shadows. The scream that followed was short-lived, swallowed by the storm. The remaining group didn't stop. They moved silently, clinging to the shadows as they tried to outmaneuver the creature. Sean's mind raced, replaying every video he'd ever watched about survival. His boots sank into the snow with every step, the cold biting at his exposed skin. Hours seemed to pass as they trudged through the forest, the creature's presence always just behind them. When they finally saw the faint glow of a highway, relief flooded through Sean. They emerged from the woods, waving down the first car they saw. The driver, a trucker, pulled over and helped them inside. As they explained what had happened, Sean glanced back at the forest. The creature stood at the edge, its glowing eyes the last thing he saw before the truck sped away. Sean knew he would never forget that night. The storm, the loss of his friend, and those eyes watching from the darkness would haunt him forever. The forest stretched endlessly before Chuck Davidson, a sea of green and shadows that seemed to whisper ancient secrets. He had agreed to join his friends for a hike through the wooded trails of Maine. A place they had all heard was beautiful this time of year. Though Chuck was more accustomed to the wide-open skies and rugged mountains near Denver, where he worked as a mechanic, the allure of Maine's dense wilderness was too enticing to pass up. He liked a challenge, and the isolation sounded refreshing. The day began under a clear blue sky, the summer sun dappling the forest floor with patches of golden light. Chuck and his friends, Ben, Carla, and Lila, started their hike early, the crisp morning air filled with the scent of pine and earth. They carried light packs with supplies for the day, water, snacks, and a few basic tools. Chuck, ever the practical one, had also brought a sturdy multi-tool, a small hatchet, and a flashlight. The trails were well marked at first, winding through groves of towering trees and alongside a gentle stream. But as they ventured deeper, the path became less defined. Chuck noticed the silence creeping in. The usual sounds of birds and insects faded, replaced by an eerie stillness that set his nerves on edge. By the time they stopped for lunch near a small clearing, the wind had picked up, rustling the treetops and carrying with it an uneasy feeling. As they ate, Chuck's mind wandered to the rumors he'd heard about the area. Tales of strange creatures lurking in the woods had circulated among locals for decades. Some said they were spirits, others swore they were cryptids, unexplained entities that defied logic. Chuck wasn't one to believe in tall tales, but he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that they weren't alone. The first encounter happened as they packed up to move on. Carla froze, her eyes fixed on the tree line. "Did you see that?" she whispered. The others followed her gaze, but all they saw were shadows. Chuck's pulse quickened. He had glimpsed something earlier, a flash of movement, low to the ground, but had dismissed it as a deer or a fox. Now he wasn't so sure. "Probably just an animal," Ben said, though his voice wavered. The group pressed on, the trail now barely discernible. The wind grew stronger, whipping through the trees with a mournful howl. Shadows danced along the forest floor, playing tricks on their eyes. Then it came again. Movement, this time accompanied by a low growl. Chuck turned, his hand instinctively reaching for the hatchet at his belt. The others huddled close, their eyes darting in all directions. "Whatever it is, it's following us," Chuck said, his voice low. The growl grew louder, and the creature emerged briefly from the shadows. It was unlike anything Chuck had ever seen. Hunched and angular, its skin pale and stretched taut over its frame. Its eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, and its movements were jerky, almost insect-like. "Run!" Chuck shouted, and they bolted down the trail. They ran until their lungs burned, the wind tearing at their clothes and the forest closing in around them. The creature's growls faded, but its presence lingered, a suffocating weight that pressed down on them. When they finally stopped to catch their breath, the sun had dipped low in the sky, casting long shadows over the forest. Chuck knew they couldn't make it back to the car before nightfall. They would have to set up camp and wait until morning. Reluctantly, they gathered wood and lit a fire in a small clearing. The flames cast flickering light on their anxious faces as they huddled together, weapons close at hand. Chuck kept the hatchet within reach, his knuckles white as he gripped it. The night was restless. The wind howled through the trees, masking the sounds of the creature that continued to stalk them. Chuck's thoughts drifted to his family, his sister back in Denver, who had always teased him about his adventurous spirit, and his father, who had taught him how to handle tools and face challenges head-on. He wondered if they would ever see him again. Sometime after midnight, the creature attacked. It lunged from the shadows, its jagged teeth bared. The group scattered, each grabbing what they could and fleeing into the darkness. Chuck ran blindly, his heart pounding as he navigated the treacherous terrain. The creature pursued them, its growls echoing through the forest. Chuck heard a scream, Lila's, and then silence. His stomach twisted, but he couldn't stop. He moved as quietly as he could, sticking to the shadows and avoiding open spaces. By dawn, Chuck and Ben were the only ones left. They stumbled onto a dirt road, their clothes torn and their faces pale with exhaustion. A truck appeared in the distance, its headlights cutting through the early morning mist. They flagged it down, and the driver, an older man with a weathered face, helped them into the cab. As they explained what had happened, Chuck glanced back at the forest. The creature was gone, but its presence lingered in his mind. He knew he would never forget the terror of that night, nor the friends he had lost to the shadows. The desert seemed endless, a canvas of russet sands and jagged rocks stretching beneath the Arizona sun. Nick Johnson, a man who had spent most of his life in Los Angeles, was used to a different kind of heat, the thick, smoggy air clinging to the city streets. But out here, the air was dry, the kind that parched your throat with every breath. Nick wasn't one to shy away from manual labor. His hands were calloused from years of blue-collar work, and the idea of a hike in the desert didn't faze him. At least, not at first. He and 3 friends, Carlos, Mia, and Trent, had decided to take a break from their day-to-day routines and explore one of Arizona's lesser-known trails. The path wound through rocky outcrops, its edges crumbling into steep drops. Cacti dotted the landscape, their sharp spines a warning to keep your distance. The day began uneventfully. The sky was an unbroken stretch of blue, and the heat wasn't yet oppressive. They joked as they walked, their laughter bouncing off the canyon walls. Nick found himself thinking of his family back in LA. His sister's knack for storytelling, his dad's endless advice on staying prepared. He chuckled, wondering what they'd say about him trekking through the desert with a group of friends. By midday, the heat had intensified, and the group stopped in the shade of a rocky overhang to rest. Nick had packed light, as always. A bottle of water, a knife, a small flashlight, and a multi-tool. He wasn't one to over-prepare, but he liked having the essentials on hand. The first sign of trouble came as they resumed their hike. The air, calm and still all morning, felt heavier now. It wasn't the heat, it was something else, a prickling sensation at the back of Nick's neck. "Do you feel that?" Mia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Feel what?" Trent replied, though his tone betrayed his unease. "Like we're being watched," she said. Nick scanned the horizon. The desert was vast and open, with no obvious place for anything or anyone to hide. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling. His mind wandered to a TV show he'd watched about Wendigos, the creatures of Native American folklore, said to be cursed spirits of insatiable hunger. The idea seemed absurd in the harsh light of day, but something about the quietness of the desert made it hard to dismiss. Then they heard it. A soft, scraping sound, like claws against stone. "Did you hear that?" Carlos asked, his voice tight. "Probably an animal," Nick said, though he wasn't convinced. The sound came again, closer this time. The group fell silent, their eyes darting toward the source of the noise. Something moved in the shadows beneath a nearby rock formation, a flash of pale, emaciated limbs and hollow eyes that sent a chill down Nick's spine. "Run," Nick whispered. They bolted down the trail, the creature's guttural growls echoing behind them. Nick's heart pounded as he navigated the uneven path, his boots kicking up clouds of dust. He didn't look back. He didn't dare. When they finally stopped to catch their breath, the sun was dipping low in the sky. The creature was gone, but the oppressive feeling of being watched lingered. Nick's mind raced. He thought of his dad's advice. Always know your way out. But out here, the trails blurred into one another, and landmarks were hard to distinguish. They moved cautiously, speaking in hushed tones. The creature stalked them from the shadows, its movements just out of sight. At one point, it let out a low, mournful wail that froze them in their tracks. Nick gripped his knife, his knuckles white. "Keep moving," he said, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his chest. They continued in silence, every rustle of the wind and crack of a twig setting their nerves on edge. As night fell, they huddled around a small fire in a shallow ravine. The flames flickered, casting eerie shadows on the rock walls. Nick's thoughts drifted again to his family. His sister would have loved this. A real-life horror story to weave into her tales. His dad would have scolded him for not carrying a map or a compass. The creature attacked just before dawn. It was a blur of pale limbs and razor-sharp teeth, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. Carlos was the first to react, swinging a branch he'd picked up earlier. The creature shrieked and retreated, but it was clear they wouldn't be safe for long. "Go!" Nick shouted, and they ran once more, their footsteps echoing in the canyon. The trail narrowed, forcing them to move single file. Nick stayed at the back, his knife drawn. The creature followed, its growls growing louder. By the time they reached the edge of the trail, the first light of dawn was creeping over the horizon. The creature didn't follow them into the open, disappearing into the shadows like a nightmare fading with the morning light. They stumbled into a small town, their clothes torn and their faces pale. The locals listened to their story with skeptical expressions, but Nick didn't care. He knew what he had seen, and he knew he would never forget the terror of that day in the Arizona desert.